Welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. I'm Barney Hoskins, and I'm on a screen with my colleagues Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
And Jasper Mirison Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
And joining us all the way from Brooklyn for this episode is Mr. Andrew Smith. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, thank you very much. Thrilled to be here. Literally
thrilled. Great. Yeah, fantastic. Andrew's just published his third book, Devil in the Stack, A Coding Odyssey, and we'll be talking to him about it and about the digital revolution and AI and all of that fun stuff. We'll also be hearing clips from an audio interview with Björk, and we will mark the 30th anniversary of the Notorious B.I.G's first album, Ready to Die. First off, Andrew, you were born in Greenwich Village, but educated in Hastings, as you said before we started recording, via San Francisco. So this is an interesting childhood. And did this peripatetic childhood have any specific impact on your early musical kind of education and preferences?
Oh, massively, I think, because I was born into Greenwich Village because it was cheap at that point. And when I was doing research for my first book, Moondust, I found out that actually the week I was born, Bob Dylan moved in 10 doors down. Wow. I was at 184 West 4th Street.
Okay.
And so the Village Vanguard was literally across the street.
Wow.
So Coltrane at the Village Vanguard was that year.
Oh my God.
It's when I look back on my childhood, then we moved to San Francisco during the Summer of Love. I'm slightly frustrated because I was too young to really partake of any of this stuff.
I hope you were too young.
You failed to turn on, tune in and drop out, I think.
Yeah, no, I tried. Arguments over the length of my hair was about as far as it got with that in California, which was perennial and endless, by the way. But no, it totally did, because I remember being at kindergarten and the Beatles, I guess, had already been in America. 63 was a couple of years before that. And the Beatles and the Monkees were everywhere. I preferred the Monkees at that age. But I was just surrounded by all this great music. And my local playground was Washington Square Park. I spent a lot of time in the sandpits there. Bands were always coming in to take album cover photos in that. And so music was just all around me. And then in the Bay Area, when we moved there, similar thing, really, because one of my best friend's brother was in a band called Lovers Satisfaction, and I was just like, that's great. And the school dancers had these psych bands and prog rock bands coming in from the city who someone's mum had seen or thought were really good, and all the kids would be standing there in rows trying to figure out how to dance to this stuff. But it was just absorbed and imbibed. And then we moved back to England. My parents are both English. My dad was a madman.
Oh.
He actually, the first series of Mad Men is exactly the year they moved there. And he went there because he was a working class boy from Hastings. His dad worked for the council, was a manual worker, no books in the house at all. But he was evacuated. His whole school was evacuated during the war, because the German bombers, if they had any bombs left after bombing London, would often drop them on these coastal towns. So they moved to St. Albans, and he was billeted with the headmaster of the school. So suddenly he was surrounded by books. And he fell in love with the books of Damon Runyon, who's it's all not as widely read now, but it's the stories around the low life around Times Square. Guys and Dolls come from it. Fell in love with New York, and he moved there because he was a copywriter. He wanted to be a writer all his life, my dad, but he had to support family, so he was a copywriter. And he would never, ever have been able to do that in the UK because he didn't have the old school tie.
Right.
So I feel like I owe America a lot, really.
Your dad was Don Draper, basically.
He was. It's very hard to imagine my dad like that. He used to tell a story about the first day when he took it, because again, you're a working class boy from Hastings. His workmates took him out for lunch on the day he arrived, and they all sat along a long table, and they were going to have cocktails beforehand. And they started with my dad being the guest, and they said, "Oh, what would you like to drink?" And he didn't know any cocktails or anything. He just said, "Could I have a glass of sherry?" And they all just guffawed and thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard.
That is brilliant. So by the time you got back to England, you'd done Greenwich Village, you'd done Haight-Ashbury, and now you're confronted with the music scene in Hastings. So what was that?
Which is, well, at first I was confronted with London because my mum's side of the family is from London, from Acton and Ealing, that area, Shepherd's Bush. And the first thing I had to do was another musical thing, is that we arrived the year of Killer Queen and Kung Fu fighting, and all the local London kids wanted to take me on and fight me with their Kung Fu moves because I was American, and they assumed I must be incredibly hard or think I was hard.
Everybody was Kung Fu fighting. Those kids were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening.
And when I got to Hastings, where I went to the same school my dad went to, which is Hastings Grammar then. It went comprehensive, I think, in my third year. And all the kids would just be going, Andy, have you ever shot anyone? Have you ever robbed a bank? And I was going, no, I think that's Starsky and Hutch you're thinking of. The whole of America is not like that.
I take it you had an American accent at this point.
I did. And my nickname was Hank. But they were, the kids were lovely, actually. And my musical palette did change at that point because Bowie, for a kid my age, was really not known in the States. Ziggy Stardust would have happened, but it wasn't mainstream. And all of a sudden, we were all sitting around listening to Hunky Dory and stuff like that, and Roxy music. That was entirely new to me. So the musical palette really changed. The Canterbury scene was happening down the road. And in Hastings Pier was on the gig circuit. So when punk happened, all the big punk bands were coming and playing there. So we saw everyone, really. And that was amazing. So actually living there was good, within stone's throw of London. It was great. And that was the first thing of the musical movements I passed through as a child. That was the first one I was the right age for.
Of course.
And, for all of us, I'm sure it changed everything and was amazing. Yeah.
Is it
so
true
I feel lucky for that.
Is it true you auditioned for The Clash? Or is that just a sort of Wikipedia urban legend?
That is actually true. Yeah,
true.
I played in bands, so I moved to London, and yes, they had, when they booted Mick Jones out. I don't know if you remember this, but they had they had these big open auditions. It was a very Clash thing to do, and it was just that all the musicians wanted ads used to be in the back of Melody Maker, as you probably remember, and there was just a big sort of quarter-page ad saying "Major Band wants guitarist." You knew that Mick Jones had just left the Clash. So you kind of thought, oh, this is probably the Clash. I don't know. And so you'd call up and you'd tell them what you'd done. And if they thought it was interesting, they just said, in the case of the London one, I think they did several around the country. And in the case of the London one, they just said, okay, turn up 11 a.m., Electric Ballroom in Camden. We're not telling you anything more than that. And you went. And I just remember walking along the road and seeing a line of blokes. It was, I think, all blokes with kind of pineapples on their head and crazy hair, like I also had. And you just queued up and you went in, and the Electric Ballroom's, quite a big space when it's empty. And there was just a Marshall stack on the stage with a lead hanging down, spotlight on it, a table halfway up. I seem to recall Magenta Divine being there and some of the, I don't know who would have been the management at that point, because I think they were between, weren't they? And but managerial looking people on the table at the back, and you just went and sat around. And when you felt man enough, brave enough, you went and they played this terrible backing tapes, this kind of weird little electronic things. And I remember sitting trying to work out the key of one. It was like F sharp minor or something. It's not a general thing you find in pop. And when you felt brave enough, you just went up and plugged in and just blammed away to this thing. I couldn't swear that I wasn't wearing leg warmers. So I was probably done. Before I started. And I think the thing to do, what they wanted you to do, I think they recruited two guys from the Bristol one, the one they did in Bristol in the end. And I think what you were meant to do is go and ignore the fucking music and just play your own thing and just, crash through it.
Then you'd have made it to the next round.
Then you'd have made it to the next round.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It was still, I think, the scariest thing I've done. And when I do, I end up on stages a lot these days, and sometimes quite large ones, despite myself. And I've never really felt as frightened as that once at the Royal Festival Hall with Buzz Aldrin. when I had to host it.
Right.
You were really lucky not to get the gig because that version of the Clash was just awful.
It was bad. I do think, I will die believing this, that "This Is England" is one of his best lyrics.
Okay.
Listen to it. Go back and listen to it again. No.
Mark doesn't listen to lyrics anyway, so it's...
Yeah, I don't listen to lyrics.
I've got my motorcycle jacket, but I'm walking all the time. It's just such a great line. Black shadow falls across a triumph line. I've got my motorcycle jacket, but I'm walking all the time. Summed up
bad.
England.
No, it's not bad.
That's a good couplet.
Bad. Yeah.
That is a good couplet.
Black shadow of its suns falls on a triumph line. I got my motorcycle jacket, but I'm walking all the time.
I don't mean to be controversial or anything.
No,
But,
it's great. It's great. Listen, we're going to jump forward to the earliest piece we have by you on RBP, Andrew, is from October 1988, and it's a review of a Level 42 album in Melody Maker. And it just starts with the very short line, "Level 42 make me feel bad, full stop."
You're joking. Did I write that?
That's the opening sentence. And it's
love.
As you might expect, it's a withering review of Mark King and his jazz funk combo. They made you feel bad. Now, would that have been one of the earliest pieces?
I think that might have been the first piece I wrote. The first thing I wrote to them.
Okay.
I'd actually had because I've been sort of playing bands and doing stuff until I got a job as features editor at International Musician magazine.
Which is for whom you interviewed Talk, of course, Mark Hollis.
Yeah, that's right. For the first time. And you know what? I'd forgotten until I saw it on RBP a little while ago, and I'd forgotten that I did that for International Musician because I'd interviewed him later for the Sunday Times.
Sunday Times, right.
And that was interesting because when I think about that period, I still do think of Talk as being one kind of high watermarks of 80s music. And so I had to learn very quickly to type and all that kind of stuff. And it was Richard Desmond who owned that magazine, who obviously went on to be this kind of cultural pariah.
Yes.
And he was a
friend of Robert Jenrick.
You know it. Yeah, you know it. And he was a foul-mouthed old bastard. I stayed about 10 months. And basically until I had something I could show to the music papers. And once I had that, sent it to Melody Maker and then went there.
They had the crappiest covers of any music magazine.
That is true.
Ever in history, I think.
That is actually true.
I mean, laughably poor illustration.
Was Richard Desmond a frequent face in the office?
Yeah. There would be editorial meetings every week, and he would come, and he was, like I say, he was really foul-mouthed, and he'd sit there, and that was an odd experience because he had a stable of down market magazines.
Yes.
So you had us at the end, which is kind of the jewel in his crown. And then there was Fitness magazine where there were all, lots of all women running that. And then you went over and there was Penthouse.
Yes.
And a weird sex magazine called Forum, which was trying to be intellectual.
God, yes. I remember
and then there was Mountain Biking magazine. And it just kind of went on like that throughout. It was really weird.
I mean, the reason I asked is a woman I knew was at the Daily Express for virtually all her journalistic career. He took over and she said it was exactly what you described, a torrent of abuse the whole time. Yeah. He'd just come in and just shout filth at people. And she said, it's a really horrible experience.
It's not nice. You wouldn't introduce him to your mum.
Aside from all that,
what the owner of Penthouse magazine, you wouldn't introduce to your mum.
Yeah, I know it's crazy, but
so you worked at the Face under Cheryl Garrett as a features editor. What are your memories of that time? And am I right in saying you interviewed Jeff Bezos for the Face? Is that possible? You certainly interviewed him.
That I did. That was for the Observer. And
that was the Observer.
I think that might be the last one he did. And it was when the Amazon shares, the share price had gone down to $1.72. And the nicknames that everyone had, all wags had for Amazon was Amazon.org and Amazon.toast. Everyone really thought it was going down.
And you didn't buy any shares at that point, Andrew, I'm guessing. Otherwise, you'd be living in some palace somewhere.
I would. I know. I did think about it because I came back from Seattle going, he's going to make that work. He knows what he's doing. It's going to work. But I just thought it'd be a conflict of interest. And so I didn't. And then, but I could have done after sort of, I don't know.
Yeah.
one of many dodgy financial missed opportunities, I'm sure. But no, you were asking about Cheryl and the face. And actually that was, of all my journalistic gigs, that was my favorite.
Yeah.
I learned so much working with people like, Chris Heath and Helen, and lives in Brooklyn up the road from me. I still see him. See him a lot. We were out last week for a drink.
Oh, great.
And I just watching, I don't know about you, but I always found that wherever I was, however good the people who were already established there were, that was going to be an indicator of how much progress I was going to make. Because I always found that I'd watch what they were doing and learn from it, and my stuff would get better from doing that. And I always feel, I expect you feel the same. I always feel like I'm completely indebted to everyone I ever worked with and all the good editors. And Cheryl was the smartest of anyone I've ever worked with. Mm-hmm. She was really super bright and really understood the readership. And what it meant was you could do all kinds of things. When that first digital to analog to digital switch over in communications, I was off writing a piece on what that was going to mean for the world, and going up onto the top percent pools with Scanner when you could buy those little when mobile phones were still analog until the late 90s, and you could get these scanners up Tottenham Court Road where you could just turn a dial around. You could hear every mobile phone conversation within a mile's radius. And we were doing that. This guy Scanner made records based on that.
I remember Scanner. Yeah.
And that was really fascinating, and trying to work out what it was going to mean for surveillance society and all the rest of it. And you could only do that in the face because you knew that if you found it interesting, the readership would. Right. And Cheryl would give you the latitude to do that. Yeah. And so, it was great.
Yeah, brilliant woman. We did a wonderful podcast episode with her in lockdown when her, was it Adventures in Wonderland book about the whole kind of rave era came out. She was tremendous. It was a gas.
She's a really exceptional human being.
So were you writing for The Face when you were kind of headhunted by the Sunday Times to be their chief pop critic?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. Robert Sandel had been who became, I didn't know him at the time, but actually we met on the day I went in to meet the Sunday Times people, and we became really best friends. It was interesting because I always sort of thought, as I moved up through the national press, the kind of higher profile, more mainstream press, I always thought that the people would get smarter and the environment would be more stimulating. And I actually kind of found the opposite. The collection of people that were, not that I didn't enjoy those experiences and learn from them, but the collection of people that I was around at Melody Maker, and I think this would also be true for people at the NME, was the brightest, smartest, most inspiring group of people I've ever worked with still to this day. At The Face, it was sort of similar. The Sunday Times, I enjoyed it, but I was full-time music there. And I did do some things for the magazine that weren't music, but it was mostly just music. And I loved it for the first year and a half. And then at the end of it, when the Observer came and said, come and be a general feature for us on the magazine, you can write about music still if you want to, and I did, but was doing all kinds of stuff. And I was so glad when I'd made that move to get my music back for myself, because I used to come back, I was kind of on my own as the music writer there. Eventually they recruited some other people, and they introduced album reviews really quickly before anyone was ready for it, least of all me. And I was on my own. And I used to I'd go away on holiday and come back, and there would be 6 of those giant post office bags, grey bags, just full of CDs. And that sounds like a dream.
No.
But actually, if you're
not.
I was probably too, because I'd played in bands and I knew what went into making records. I was probably too conscientious, and I really did try and listen to everything that came to me. And I think I found that very difficult. So that was the most high profile and best paid job of them all. But actually, probably the one I enjoyed least.
Yeah. You may be pleased to know that Johnny Black of kind of Q and Mojo fame recently very kindly and generously donated his entire archive to Rock's Back Pages, and there are folders and folders that I'm surrounded by now of cuttings, as well as the magazines that he gave us. There's just thousands and thousands of cuttings, and in amongst those are lots of your cuttings from the Sunday Times.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Bloody hell.
Yes.
Wow.
So we will be, over the course of time, digitizing and OCRing them, and they will hopefully find their way onto Rock's Back Pages. So if there's anything that you don't have or curious about. But yeah, and I do see little album reviews from the Sunday Times with AS, lots of AS album reviews. So, you may not want to see, it may just bring back the nightmares of the what you came into. Yeah.
It wasn't nightmarish. I didn't hate it, but I was pleased. You know what it's like? Because we're all music fans. We love hearing music, and I love to be able to follow my muse, like, everyone does, and who loves music. And you can't really do that when you're under that kind of pressure to be producing.
Like a recipe for ear fatigue to have to listen to that many albums. I mean, how do you ever enjoy anything if you have to constantly be thinking, well, how am I going to pithily sum this up in a paragraph?
Yeah, and also there are some things that you have to write about on a mainstream paper like that you might prefer to spend your time listening to something else, but you just have to do it because the readers want to know about it. They might be thinking about buying it. So I had a good time in lots of ways, but was very pleased to leave that behind.
Yeah. We're going to really leap forward at this point, and we will kind of go back again a bit later, but to your new book, Devil in the Stack, A Coding Odyssey, or at least it's a coding odyssey here, and it appears to be just a code odyssey in America.
In the US.
That's
US. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the fun things when you do a book is that if it goes to different places, you get different interpretations. So look at the UK cover. That's that. And look, the US cover. Completely different. Completely different interpretation.
Maybe we'll try and put both of those on the cover of the episode somehow.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I like both. Both. But
well, on the back of the UK edition, published by Grove Press here, the first paragraph is describes the book as this: a riveting, alarming, sharp-eyed journey into the bizarre world of computer code, told through the author's sometimes painful, often amusing attempt to become a coder himself. So it's a big book. There's a lot of history in it. You go back to the kind of dawn of computing, and it addresses, the somewhat alarming future that we're all kind of confronted with. I'm just going to single out at this point. It's chapter 14, which is entitled Algorave, one word, Algorave ? As in algorithms and rave. And Algorave, it turns out, is actually a sort of genre, kind of mutant genre. But what I really appreciated was you talking about the kind of the digital revolution in music, and you go back to the 1980s here, and you say, there is a symmetry to my finally connecting with code through music, because music was where most of us sensed the looming digital shift and its prickly trade-offs, a full decade ahead of the web. And you then go on to talk about electronic music, going all the way back to kind of, Delia Derbyshire in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And you make the point that, a lot of us will think of kind of synth pop and electronic music as sort of maybe all kind of one thing, but you really make the point that there's a massive difference, between the analog construction of a Human League record like Sound of the Crowd and something like Absolute by Scritti Politti. You say you'll marvel at the difference in palette between two artists who sprang from the same post-punk electro foment. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of them, as being sort of two records that were sort of completely unalike, of course. But you really go into the kind of, you talk about the DX7, the Yamaha DX7 keyboard, and you talk about digital sound. And can you just, for the listeners, can you explain what happened when like analog electronic sound became digital electronic sound?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And And as I say, most of us did experience it for the first time there. And because music is music and you can hear it, you can actually hear the shift. Whereas everything else, like when mobile phones went digital from analog, most of us would never have noticed.
No.
But the impact was as profound. It's just as hidden. And one thing that we talk about analog and digital a lot, without most of us really fully understanding it. And the word analog actually stands for analogous.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that a sound is being taken, converted into electrical impulses that represent the sound. So they are analogous to the sound. And then they're taken to a speaker and converted back to sound. Whereas in digital, as probably most people do know this part, is that the sound is converted into numbers and then sent down the line. And the thing about an analog signal is that it can decay. It can be changed by the electronics that it's passing through.
Yeah.
Whereas the digital one, numbers are completely and infinitely reproducible, which created huge problems, of course, about 15 years later, when suddenly file sharing happened, because you could share a piece of music absolutely infinitely as many times as you wanted. Whereas vinyl, you couldn't do that. You had to take it away, record it onto cassettes, and then you were going to have to reproduce them. It was a big palaver. And so that was really big. And what it meant was that things like samplers became possible, because you could take any sound source, convert it into numbers, and then produce it accurately at the other end. So it opened up a lot of doors. I think what a lot of us took quite a long time to realize, and weirdly, I felt this probably particularly keenly, because when I first moved to London, I went and worked for the record and tape exchange empire in Notting Hill.
Yes.
And they had a music shop, a music store that sold musical instruments, hi-fi, electronic things and stuff like that. And I worked in there. So we would get all the old redundant instruments when they were coming in, but we'd also get the new ones when they came in too. So we were there when CDs came in. And we spent a lot of time comparing them. And we all thought, these are great. They sound so sharp and clear. And what you realized later was that actually, when they remastered these things for CDs, mostly what they'd done is just turn up the top end. So what we took for clarity wasn't really that. It was just more top end, more treble. And we all switched to CDs. And it was really about another 20 years before many of us started to go, actually, I think vinyl actually sounds better. And the thing that we were told was that because CDs and digital sound could be very accurately reproduced, that it was going to sound better. You could get more information on it. Actually, the opposite is true, because if you take a digital system, you have increments that coincide to numbers, to digits. And if you take, say, 10 increments, 1 to 9 or 0 to 9, as a computer sees it, the space in between those digits doesn't exist. It's meaningless. You're going to move from 0 to 1 to 1 to 2 to 2 to 3, and nothing in between. The only way you can get more accuracy, you can get more kind of atomistic with it, is by then subdividing those increments, so that then you have 1 to 10 in between 2 and 3 as well. And you can do that, but it starts to get increasingly messy, and you need more and more power and more computing. Whereas on vinyl, on an analog system, you have a signal, and the signal can always be subdivided, always. So you can represent anything. Whereas with a digital system, there's a limit to what you're going to be able to be. And the limit might be along the way down the line.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, and we also like the warmth that you tend to get with analog. We quite like the fact that the sound can decay a little bit. So
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you up to point. I mean, I was a working musician as we went from analog to digital in that process.
Right.
And I think in those days that digital was absolutely crude in a certain sort of way. And as you say, the mastering of records was terrible. Some people started fixing it. I mean, Blood and Fire, the reggae reissue label, were the first people to really start producing CDs which sounded fabulous. And they did sound fabulous. Now, people have increased the number of divisions. I mean, the bit rate of recording has massively increased. I listen to a lot of classical music these days, and the analog, the revisiting of vinyl has simply not happened in the classical world, because you can't get silence. And now silence is actually really important in classical music. absolute silence, So, in fact, you really hear the sound of the room with no tape hiss, no surface noise. I think that actually now, finally, people are really beginning to crack the process of recording digitally. Whilst all my friends are rebuying vinyl, which I think is great if you've got a fantastic system, but if you haven't got a fantastic system, it's actually really poor. And so I'm sort of like, I straddle both sides of this.
I agree with you, actually. I think the interesting thing for me is not because I use both. And what's interesting to me is that there are trade-offs, particularly when technologies first arrive.
Yeah.
Normally you're gaining some stuff and then you're losing some stuff. And the stuff that you're losing often takes longer to see. I mean, I wouldn't be without the digital revolution because I use both. I have a hi-fi system, and then we have Sonos around the house as well, which is a very good streaming system. And the speakers on my hi-fi are better, so they sound better, but better speakers, But if you'd said to me 30 years ago or less, you can have all of recorded music at your fingertips. So if I want to do a deep dive into the work of Miles Davis, I can just go and do that. And I did do that recently. And I just think, what a gift.
What a blessing.
I mean, it's just incredible. And I look at my kids who, weirdly, my son writes about music. He works for Electronic Sound magazine.
Okay.
And we've actually written about some of the same people. And it passes down. But he's so much better informed than I was, because when I was at school, you had to go and buy an album if you wanted to, or have a friend who had it.
Yeah.
And so you were quite limited in where you could go. And if you were adventurous, you were going to have to really work hard for it. And so I wouldn't swap it. What I think is interesting is the fact that we make these trade-offs.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the book is really about the trade-offs that we make as we go through this period.
There's an interesting element about the DX7 that you write about that I think has, forgive the unintentional pun, analogous things to do with the way that we listen to music as well, which is that you write about how there were 32 preset sounds on the DX7 and you could program more, but it was very cumbersome to do. So basically nobody did. And so every record started to feature the same 32 sounds. Yeah. And the same sorts of, weirdly, even though the way to describe it, we have access to the whole history of recorded music, weirdly, increasingly we get funneled into the same listening pathways by algorithms that we don't understand, that are basically designed to give the major labels as much of the streaming pie as possible, and for Spotify to keep as much of the streaming pie as it can. So there's this sort of strange thing of like, yes, extremely convenient, but also oddly limiting in a way that is difficult to see without taking a step back from it.
I think you're absolutely right, Jasper. Yeah. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but I noticed it here in Brooklyn, that if I go into the supermarket, the range of music I'm hearing is narrowing. There's no question about this. It is narrowing because what algorithms do is reinforce themselves.
Yes.
Especially machine learning, what we call AI, which is not AI at all. It's machine learning. Yeah. What they're doing is always reinforcing. And at the heart of computer code is loops, and what loops do is they loop around, they reinforce. If they're reinforcing something good, the world gets better. If they're reinforcing something bad, it gets worse. And we can't see it either way until we feel the effects of it. So I think you're absolutely right there. I do think that one of our greatest enemies, like finishing this book, one of the things I felt is one of our greatest enemies, and the thing we have to most guard against going forward, is convenience. Because all these things are couched in convenience. And if we just accept them as, hey, well, this makes my life easier, actually, long run, our lives are going to get worse.
Yeah.
But going back to the DX7, that's an interesting one, because I'm keen to talk about DX7.
Well, I mean, our producer, Jamie, my band's producer, had one of the first DX7s that came into the country. And at first, we just thought this was sensational. Then we sort of asked the question, how do you change the sounds? And suddenly you're in this horrible world of stuff in this tiny readout, which is incomprehensible. So, as you said, use the 32 presets. Being a soul boy, for me, it was the electric piano sound, that sort of pseudo Rhodes you heard over every R&B record, basically from about 1986 onwards. That tinkling, bloody electric piano. And I came to absolutely despise it.
Yeah.
It was the tubular bells that did it for me, that you hear on Do They Know It's Christmas? That what passes for a hook on that record. And you heard that in 1984, you heard that on almost every record. I had the same experience as you because I working in that shop in Notting Hill for that eccentric organization. I had quite an early one too, and I spent weeks programming it and coming up with these kind of dribbly, farty, rumbly sounds and thinking, I can't see any use for that. Do you know who the only person who really did work out how to do it was Brian Eno, and the Apollo album is apparently largely drawn from those sounds that I heard and went, no, I can't use that.
I mean,
you know,
I had a kind of a late analog synth, the Roland JX8P, which had a sort of digital input, but you could get a box on top which had knobs, and it was the old school stuff, the oscillators and so on and so forth. And it was the fattest, warmest sounding instrument I ever owned in my life. Yeah. So
great.
Yeah, it was a taste of things to come. That we gained lots of new capabilities, but also a little bit less control.
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew, if we go back to your journalism, two of the sort of key acts of the 90s who overtly embraced electronic music were Björk and Radiohead, and we're featuring the interviews you did with them. Björk in 1995, Radiohead in 2000 on the current homepage. Björk you interviewed for Ray Gun when it's not actually her second album, but to all intents and purposes, her second album, Post, was about to come out. It's a great sort of portrait of, a genuinely fascinating person, I think. And I think, one of the kind of greatest and most uninhibited singers of my lifetime. I think she's, I think she's so special. How do you recall that encounter in Maid of Vale when she was following up the debut album Debut?
Right. Well, interesting. One interesting thing, she invited me to her house to do it. That was where she lived. And I'd seen her with Sugar Cubes. I don't know if any of you were. There was a show they did at the Cambridge Theatre in Cambridge Circus in London. And it was amazing, that band, because she was so extraordinary. And then they had the singer Einar, the guy who was singing a lot. And everyone would always come away from the gigs going, could he just shut up and let her sing more?
God, absolutely. He was a pain in the arse, wasn't he?
He really was. And when she was singing, they were fantastic. And so when she was making solo records, you just went, oh, finally, we can do this.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that I'd been to Iceland was just opening up, had kind of just opened up at that point a few years before. And I went on an extraordinary trip with Happy Mondays and a guy called Gerald, where they went and took over. Happy Mondays were the first band from outside Iceland to play there in, I don't know how long. Okay. And a guy called Gerald we went with the Brain Club, which used to be in Leicester Square. And they just took over a nightclub for the night. And it was really fascinating because Iceland was really Icelandic then. You go there now, you meet lots of Americans and lots of other European people. Yeah. But then you didn't. And they'd only just made alcohol legal. They had prohibition for decades. And so that became a problem in the nightclub because people weren't used to holding their alcohol. And it was, but you sort of realize that the way that Iceland runs, being such a small population, really facilitates people like Björk, because everyone knows each other. The way people explain to me is that you make a record and then you'll walk along the street to give it to the DJ at the national radio station, who probably goes out with your brother or something. And it is very, and people are very peripatetic. So they will do right across the arts. And this happens in the culture generally too. They have these poetry slams in rural communities that farmers do. So the big, gathering for the farmers is to go and they all just improvise this poetry and read poems and stuff. And you think, okay. And I also went for the Observer one time. I went on an Icelandic trawler for a fortnight because climate change was happening and cod had disappeared from around the British Isles, but the Icelanders were looking after it. The cold, as the water warmed, there was a fear that the cod would just disappear and go somewhere else. And all of the fishermen in the boat and that is the hardest job ever. You could not pay me enough to do that job full time. It is really, really, really hard. But they were all there reading kind of literary fiction and stuff in between. They're as a nation, Björk kind of makes sense when you're there. Here,
right.
Anywhere else, she seems like this very eccentric character, but she fits in quite well there. She's not quite as eccentric in that context as it seems. Well, and so what we like is the Icelandic culture as much as we like her,
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a perfect cue to talk about the week's new audio interview, because, Mark, tell us who it's with. Who is it?
Yeah, it's David Toop interviewing Björk in 2001, just about to release Vespertine, which was a big album for her. Well, one of the series of big albums for her. And it's fantastic. I ended up really liking her listening to this because, and David Toop, who's been a guest twice on our podcast, as well as something of a friend of Rock's Back Pages, and they're very well matched because they both care about language and about sort of what they're saying. And so she's talking about her working processes, how she works with other people, because as an artist, she's endlessly collaborated with different people. And she doesn't talk about musicians. She talks about the engineers and people, all people who help put the stuff together. She talks about what the album is about and how much she reveals herself as a person in the stuff and how much she doesn't. So, both things are happening. And this isn't the first clip. It's about, her faith in mystery.
Yeah, I guess I got quite a lot of faith for mystery and for obviously being in the media since I was like 11. It's sort of, I still believe that you can reveal everything, but you still have stuff for yourself, or, I guess compared to my friends, at least, I was only talking about stuff like that last night, getting a bit pissed, but that I just have this enormous faith in mystery that it's bigger than us, and that we don't know. When we say how we feel, we're just guessing anyway, we don't know anyway.
Yeah, no, so she talks a lot about the importance of storytelling, and she talks about the importance of relationships. And by that, she means not just lovers, but also just her friendships and the various people she encounters at various times in her life. Talks about lyric writing and abstraction versus narrative. That is, both have a place in that process. Embracing nature and technology, that nature and technology aren't necessarily in opposition to one another, but can work side by side. Let's listen to the next clip. This is on Vespertine, South.
I was conscious for the first time in my life when I did this album to actually create a paradise and a cocoon that I've never really. I've always kind of been this punk who wants to have everything very real and very stark and nothing. And this album is partly about creating like a cocoon of almost like a paradise that you can escape to, and even though it's it's not true, or it wouldn't, you couldn't take this cocoon anywhere, it would burst in certain places, but you still believe in the right for it to exist because just because of the need for it of humans. They need something like that so much that alone sort of justifies it.
Oh, it's great.
She goes on to talk about fantasy versus reality, tools versus the voice, which is a bit like nature and the technology conversation. She talks about how her voice has changed from homogenic, her third album, to Vespertine, and how she used her voice differently on this record. Lastly, she talks marvelously about having dinner with David Attenborough, which I'd have loved to have been the fly on the wall at. And you can kind of just see them getting on, actually. that I can almost hear that conversation in a mad sort of way.
Yeah. It's wonderful to hear her speak.
Yeah.
The things she says are so interesting. Like in the first clip where she says, we never know how we feel, we're just guessing.
Yeah.
It's like it's really profound, actually, to me.
It's very profound. That. I mean, and she's not, she's so sort of free of glibness in this interview. She really thinks about what she's saying. She's really listening to David's questions and giving them deep thought, and it's just the most wonderful conversation, I have to say.
Yeah.
Also, just her accent is so fabulous. And Andrew, in your 1995 piece, you talk about her accent as a sort of weird melange of things, and so she likes it stark or character, but then she'll go, I think it's a bit better. She has it a bit better, so she's got this kind of Soho kind of Cockney thing going on.
That's right. Yeah, her voice is lovely to hear, isn't it? On the recording.
Yes,
and she's again that thing of she has. I always think there's a sense with her that she's using technology to enthusiastically. And I don't know if you ever saw the video she did with Chris Cunningham, where there are these two automatons, both her, and they slowly come together and they start kissing, and it's one of the best music videos I've ever seen. I'm trying to remember what the song is now, but that embrace is quite typically Icelandic. It's a very modern nation, but if you talk to people, they will also tell you that fairies really do live in the rocks, the volcanic rocks in the south. And they mean it too. At first you think, they're just having me on, they're joking, they're playing up to, they're not.
She talks about poetry, actually. You were talking about that earlier in Iceland, and she sort of says, when her English friends come to Iceland, they sort of, and people start reciting poetry, they all there's that sort of English, like they'll walk out because they just don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Really weird, isn't it? That English suspicion of kind of emotion, I think, actually, which she certainly doesn't have.
She's challenging. I think one of the things that's really interesting about her is that she's had so much mainstream success, but she's also a very challenging artist. She doesn't.
God, yes.
She seldom does what you're expecting, and I think that's a rare and precious thing.
She's done extraordinary work, and she's an extraordinary performer to see live. I still would say Vespertine is my favourite album of hers. And I think, and she kind of hit the nail on the head, it's because it is like a sort of cocoon that I can retreat into. It's the most sort of rapturous, dreamlike sort of suite of songs about kind of, passion and intimacy. And I hadn't thought of it as, obviously there's a song called Cocoon on it. One of the key songs, but it really is a sort of cocoon. I think she's just magnificent, and I love her even more after listening to this.
Can't wait to hear it, because David Toop also, little props for him too. I remember my first year at college coming across in a magazine store a magazine that he was doing called Collusion.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many issues there were, but there was an article about Carol Kay, who played a lot of the bass on the Motown albums, and I think she went blind eventually, and the piece was about that. And that, to me, I hadn't really seen any kind of journalism about music that was quite like that before. It was really...
It was a great magazine. When he came on the podcast recently, we did talk about Collusion, actually. I think we have 4 of the 5 issues, and he said he would send us the first issue, which we've never owned. But, we're obviously huge fans of David Toop. And just a big shout out for his Dr. John book, which just came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, called Two-Headed Doctor, extraordinary book about and kind of around Mac Rebennack's first Dr. John album, Gree.
And interesting enough, in that book, he talks about some things that they're talking about in this interview.
Right.
Storytelling, abstraction versus narrative, and so on and so forth, because it's a book full of unreliable witnesses and missing information and so on and so forth. So, it sort of rings a bell there.
Mark, given that you were just sort of talking about the themes of sort of nature versus, or not necessarily versus technology in the Björk audio interview, can we talk just for a moment, Andrew, about AI, about where technology is taking, not just music, but the threat it poses to all sort of creative workers, artists. What is your view, having written this book about code and learned about code? Where is everything going? Is it as dystopian as some people say?
Well, the short answer to that is I think it doesn't have to be dystopian, but unless we start paying attention a little bit, it could be, for sure. The way this started was that I had no interest in computer code and hadn't used it before. But around about, 2017 or something, I started to notice that as almost everything I was doing was being mediated by code, and that was increasing, this flood of code into the world. The world didn't necessarily seem to be getting better, and actually from some angles looked as though it was sort of getting worse in proportion. I wanted to kind of figure out, A, if that was true, and then B, if it was true, what was the fault? Was it the people doing it? Are they just the kind of weirdos pop culture has coders as being? Or is it the system, that kind of uber capitalist Silicon Valley system that they work in? Or is there something about code itself which is at odds with the way we've evolved to be, which is quite a terrifying prospect, that, because we're not going to unspool ourselves from computing now. So it was a fascinating thing. I realized the only way I was going to answer those questions was to learn to code myself. And I found it very hard at first, but did end up loving it and kind of falling in love with the culture. But at the end of it, I do actually think there is a kind of glitch in the way we compute, which was evolved really very quickly in the Second World War, when the British needed to crack German codes. Mm-hmm. And the Americans were trying to calculate kind of bomb explosion sort of envelopes. And they could do that by hand, but it took a long time. Whereas the Enigma machines, the British engineers and mathematicians at Bletchley Park, there was no way that you could do it by hand in a way that was going to give you the information usefully. So they developed a computer with the tools they had. And it turns out that the people who were central to that, and the two most central, would be Alan Turing on our side, and then John von Neumann in the States, who was Hungarian, but he was in America. And von Neumann in particular thought this was just a passing phase. The way we compute, with kind of turning everything into numbers, processing those numbers. So the numbers represent something, and then getting the numbers back and then reconverting them into stuff that we understand. He thought this would be a passing phase, and that we would have better ways to compute by now. And in fact, he would be astonished if he turned up now and so you're still doing it the way we did. What's the matter with you? And wow. So it has particular problems. And one of the things that's central when you get down into it, the thing that's central to computing, you'll know the expression, the medium is the message, and the idea that a system, a medium, replicates its essence at scale. So the internet, it doesn't really matter. The specific information that you put on the internet isn't the most important thing. It's the way that it allows us to do things differently, and the way it changes our lives in the way we go about how we live. And I started to ask, well, what's the medium of computing? We think, well, silicon. Well, no, actually, you can make a computer out of anything if you have enough time to process it. You can make a computer out of sticks. In fact, in the book, I'll show you how you can make a computer out of tiny Elvis impersonators. You can really do it with anything. And
that's all I've ever wanted to do, Andrew.
I know. Well, here you go. You got the manual now. And then I thought, well, okay, so it's binary numbers. Well, no, actually, you can make decimal computers. There have been ternary computers that work on threes. Quantum computing works on kind of threes, really. And so it's not any of those things. What it is actually is it's a thing called abstraction that they talk about in computing, whereas you have down on a computer chip, the only thing that are processed are zeros and ones. That's the only thing it can deal with. Now, we can't engage with that in any meaningful way at the speed we would need to. So all these layers have been built on top of it so that we can interact. And so on the chip, it's what's called low level. And then the languages we deal with are high level. And in between, there are all these steps, which are just put inside what computers call black boxes and taken for granted. And that's called a process of abstraction. And I decided that abstraction is really the medium of computing. That's the one thing it couldn't do without the way we compute now. And what that means is that as the code goes into the world, what it's doing is producing abstraction into our lives. So globalization, for instance, really good example, couldn't have happened without computers. And what that is a process of abstraction, that something is made somewhere else, we consume it here. We might know the endpoints, but it has myriad intermediary stages that we have no idea what they are. Facebook friends, for instance, suddenly the idea of a friend expanded and became more abstracted. And that can be a great thing if you're trying to control a fusion reaction, as DeepMind in London just did a little while ago, only for a short period, but no one had ever done it before. And that's amazing. And that you couldn't do that without the abstraction. But with things that get in between people, I think the more code does that, the worse our lives are going to get.
Interesting.
So and that's quite a big idea to take on.
And there's another element within that you also write about, which is that increasingly we're building things that do things within those black boxes that we no longer know what they're doing. So a machine learning algorithm is changing itself based on a process that occurs within a black box that we can't really look into. And then it comes out the other end doing stuff that we didn't predict and that we can't actually understand why it does, because we never knew to begin with how it changed itself to do those things. And that, I think, is a major, major concern, because it really puts the dampers on this idea that, it's fine as long as we control it. Because as soon as you start saying to an optimization algorithm, refine yourself, and you stop being able to tell how it's going to refine itself, you end up with some pretty challenging outcomes, and that can be dangerous. There are things, again, that one can do about that, but it's recognizing that we need to. And one of the things that really jumps out at me, whether it's driverless cars, quote unquote, I mean, it's a phrase that many people in that industry don't like, because the idea is that you should still have a human controller, but I'm getting to that, or whether it's chatbots. I was rereading something that I wrote a while ago about AI, and the thing that stood out most was during employee test drives by Google, employees were found to overtrust AI. Now, those aren't lay people, those are Google employees, and they're overtrusting the AI that they know probably isn't going to be good. And that's how you end up with crashes of, people that are looking at their phones, and the car that's driving itself gives them control, but they don't have control because they've given up on the idea of needing control.
Absolutely.
The output of chatbots is trusted in exactly the same way. You'll just say, ChatGPT said it, so probably it's right, so I don't need to. And if we trust too much, if we overtrust our machines, we're in for a pretty short, sharp shock.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Though you do get marvelous things. A friend of mine went ChatGPT and discovered that he had died in 2014, which gave him possible. No, but sorry, Andrew.
No, they do hallucinate. I mean, there are two things. I think you're absolutely right, Jasper. And one of the problems, again, is that convenience thing. Yeah, it's much easier for us to just go, well, okay, the machine says this. And I have been using some, quotes AI in my coding stuff, because they're useful. Actually, they can be useful, but you can't overtrust it. But there are two things. One is that the simplest way of explaining how these machine learning algorithms work is that they write themselves. We let them loose on the world, and they write their own rules. And once they've written their own rules, we don't know what they are. And exactly as you say. And one of the things that there was a guy called Joseph Weizenbaum who worked at MIT in the 1950s. And he wrote the first program called ELIZA that could simulate human conversation. And he got people in and did all these experiments with them and got them in and had them interacting with the machine. And what he found was that really alarmed him. He said that it did not matter how many times he explained to people, the machine is not intelligent. It's just simulating the kind of conversation you would have a person, that people tended to start treating it as a human being, as a person, and wouldn't believe that. And we had this with a Google engineer a while back who was fired because he said that he thought that their AI had become conscious, and it hasn't. The thing about AI is it's not intelligent. It's dumb as hell. The key feature of human intelligence, and actually one of the things that's really been beneficial, I think, is that since the 50s, when there was a very famous cognitive scientist who did a lot of work on AI called Marvin Minsky. And in the 1950s, he said, we're going to get a dozen very smart people together. We should have computer intelligence within 18 months, right? And that's what they thought. And then even in the 1970s, he was saying, okay, within 5-6 years, we're going to have a computer, our computers will be able to, write sonnets, wash your car, have conversations, fly an airplane, do the whole thing. And of course, they were miles away. And the history of AI is the history of people over predicting for stuff. And I think one of the beneficiaries of that has been the animal kingdom, because we're suddenly going, hang on, wait a minute. We don't seem to be able to make computers transfer their knowledge in the way that we do. We can learn something in one context and then apply it in another context that's completely unrelated. And there's no computer that can do that yet in any meaningful way. But what we're finding is bees can do it, cuttlefish can do it. So actually the intelligence that's in the animal kingdom is enormously sophisticated, and we are nowhere near that yet.
Yeah.
So I don't worry about the machines in the short term. And I've met many people, many experts who believe that we will never have, with our present computing paradigm, we will never have a kind of intelligence that we have, or that most animals have. So I don't really worry about that in the short term, but I do worry about us just over-relying on them and they're not intelligent. And one of my fears is that what happens is they're not going to become more like us, but we will somehow meet in the middle. So we become dumber. Because what we're doing is interacting and modeling ourselves. We already start to think algorithmically.
Yeah. Well, we already outsource large parts of our intelligence to external technologies.
Yeah.
So,
that's right. And if we overdo that, I think we're probably going to suffer for it.
At this point, I do want to go back to the 90s again.
Why not?
The terror of the future is making me want to go back 30 years. It just so happens that this month is the 30th anniversary of the first album by the Notorious B.I.G, Ready to Die. And so we're featuring on the RBP homepage 3 pieces, either specifically about Biggie Smalls or about the turf wars, particularly between, the East and West Coast rap scenes. But I'll just mention 2 of those. And I know Jasper would love to say something about Biggie. But there's this, we don't really have many interviews on RBP with Biggie per se, but we have got this great piece that Sonia Poulton wrote for Music that Mark added a while back, which is just an account of going to Rotterdam, of all places, where there is a hip-hop festival featuring Coolio and the Junior Mafia, and Biggie as sort of just a kind of presence. He comes on stage, but she manages to grab a chat with him, after or before and after the show itself, and catches him at a kind of quite a melancholy place in his life. He's had this huge success with the first album, and she describes him as an introverted 22-year-old who kind of can't go outdoors anymore, and it's very poignant. So I just thought we'd kind of just say something about the man that I think Jasper certainly feels is like the greatest rapper probably to date. Jasper, do you want to just kind of say a few words about Biggie?
Happily, yeah. I mean, I love Biggie, as you just said. I think he's certainly in my top 3. It sort of rotates who I think is the best ever. It's a fun debate to have, certainly. But for me, I think what's amazing about Biggie and his music and Ready to Die is that it's so varied and so multifaceted in the way that the things that he raps about, the way that he raps about them. He's got an incredible flow and delivery. It's melodious as well as rhythmically innovative. He was so influential. I think without Biggie, hip hop just does not sound the way that it does subsequently. He's been described variously as like a jazz rapper. Like a saxophonist rapper. He learnt jazz from a neighbor, as a kid. And all of that really goes into the sound of him. And then beyond that, you also have the importance of Ready to Die at that moment in time, 1994. hip hop is really mostly being dominated by the West Coast, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, and then New York kind of needed reminding that New York was New York when it came to hip hop. And I think Ready to Die did that. And just not that New York needed to be put back on the map, but it certainly needed something to sort of, I mean, Nas was doing good things as well at the time, but yeah, he became the king of New York very briefly and sadly, so briefly. And it also manages to be a true document from his own life and has these party anthems in it. I mean, Juicy and Big Poppa, if those come on now, basically anywhere, everybody is singing along because they're just a vibe. He just does all of that in this really intuitive way for me. He's so intuitively good at what he's doing. And I mean, I could go on and I won't. I'll stop. But yeah, it's a vital album, Ready to Die, for the 90s and for the 20th century and beyond.
I was really pleased that you pulled this out to feature this week, actually, because I hadn't listened to it for a while, and I did listen to it several times last night and was astonished by how much I enjoyed it.
It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine, Salt and Pepper and Heavy D up in the limousine, hanging pictures on my wall. Every Saturday, Rap Attack, Mr. Magic, Molly Mall.
It's really stood up so well. And I love the way that some of it is almost like little drama, little dramatic vignettes and stuff in between. The way he integrates the whole thing is amazing, isn't it?
It really is. I'm just going to quote from one of the other two pieces about Biggie, which is essentially, I mean, it's sort of shocking to read it. Michael Gonzalez in New York Press, 19th of March, 1997. Basically, he's just received a copy of the second album and he's listening to it because he's going to be reviewing it. And his girlfriend knocks at the door and tells him, and he hasn't even got to the end of the record, you know, the sort of tragic irony of the title, Life After Death. She knocks at the door and tells Michael that their friend Havelock Nelson just called to say that Biggie was dead, had been shot dead in California. And he writes this piece sort of in a state of shock. And I'll just read this just short paragraph here. Although it would be false for me to try to portray Biggie as an earthly saint, it would be too simplistic a reading of B.I.G. as an artist and as a person simply to throw him into the bag of gangsterism. Like the blaxploitation fictions of old school writers Iceberg Slim, Donald Goines, the Notorious one had a beautiful way of transforming his brutal world into street poetics.
Wow.
Spot on.
Yeah, spot on. There is, and I think he says, and others have said, you know, that there is this sort of undertow of sorrow in Biggie's music. I mean, it's still sort of shocking, but it doesn't glorify violence in the way that other rappers from that era do. Yeah,
Mark, there is a melancholy. I think that's the word I'd reach for. It's partly just in the sound of his voice, among other things. And as Jasper was saying, I mean, I love Snoop Dogg for the sound of his voice. I love Biggie for the sound of his voice.
Yeah,
and with hip hop, with rap, that's central to the experience of listening to it. And with Biggie, there is just this feels like a sort of deep sadness that's just there.
What's special about that, I think, because I interviewed a bunch of the rappers, Ice Cube and Ice-T a bunch of times, and LL Cool J and all those people. And what I think is really different about Biggie is there's a vulnerability there, which I think is what you're kind of meaning by melancholy, isn't it? That he allows himself a vulnerability that the others mostly don't.
Yes.
Yeah. And he raps about, if you actually listen back, he raps about so many things. He raps about his mum having breast cancer. Even when he's rapping about women, I mean, of course, some of it has, you know, misogynistic elements. At the same time, he was liked by women. Women liked his music. Women liked him, liked hanging out with him. I mean, he was very successful with women when, you know, in a way that including
the rather fabulous Faith Evans, who was his partner.
You know, and I think that vulnerability actually probably is a part of that.
Yeah,
that would make sense.
To all the ladies in the place with style and grace, allow me to lace these lyrical douches in your bushes. Who rock grooves and make moves with all the mommies. The back of the club sipping my wet is where you.
Listen, we just have time for a couple of the pieces that you guys have added to the library. And Andrew, if you hear anything that prompts a reflection or a memory, do jump in. But Mark, do you want to just tell us about some pieces about it?
Just a couple of things, really. Richard C. Wool's reviews Trout Mask Replica for Cream 1969. With this record, Beefheart & Co. will hopefully rise from the underground cavern of complete oblivion to the more hospitable soil of relative obscurity. Thick with images, thick with rhythm innovations, the band lays a heavy batter on the curves of your consciousness, turning the furthermost flexions of your wisdom to goo. The record makes you think that way. I'll skip over the Ray Conner's John Lennon interview because the quotes are too long. Paul Nelson reviews Nevermind the Bollocks, the Sex Pistols, Rolling Stone 1978. He says, their music isn't pretty. Indeed, it often sounds like two subway trains crashing together under 40 feet of mud, victims screaming. But it has an Ahab versus Moby Dick power that can shake you like no other music today can. And those who view the Sex Pistols only in eve of destruction terms should remember that any theory of destruction, as highfalutin as Rotten's, also contains the seeds of freedom and even optimism. Anyone who cares enough to hate this much is probably not a nihilist, but irony of ironies, a moralist and a romantic as well. Which I think is a pretty interesting take.
Yeah. For the time, for one that was kind of concurrent, current at the time.
Absolutely, and for an American magazine as well. Lastly, this is just funny. Andrew Eldritch of the Sisters of Mercy, interviewed by Ted Mico for the Melody Maker in 1987. He says, I refuse point blank to do business with anyone in France, ever. The band has never played there. The band will never play there. I've never exported a single record or done one interview for the French. I believe this corrosion has made some money over there, and I fully intend to send the royalties back. I think it's the sort of gesture we all ought to make. They're a miserable, consumptive race that revels in despair. Even their language is really great at expressing that pathetic shrug of the shoulders, which English has no use for. Maybe I'll buy Morrissey a ticket there just before we go for the big one. The climate will suit him.
You can see why we all loved Andrew Eldritch so much, can't you?
Because the Sisters of Mercy never revelled in despair, not for one moment, surely.
I did see them one time at a college, because I went to University at York, and they were from Leeds, obviously, and the March Violets and Sisters of Mercy, a weekend gig in a college with about 24 people there. It was absolutely awesome.
Happy days. Happy nights.
Yeah, happy nights.
Jasper, what have you got?
I've got a couple of things to mention, first of which is thanks to William, who added a piece this week called The Fanzine Editor, Publish and Be Damned. Tom Cox in the Observer Music Monthly in November 2003, and he's just writing about his experience as an editor of a fanzine. He edited the fanzine Words I Might Have Ate. And it's just a very funny piece. It's great. He writes, as I had been competitive and sporty all my life, editing a fanzine immediately became a race to find the scuzziest, most underground bands imaginable and flaunt them in front of my fellow editors' faces. Fortunately for me, the period between Kurt Cobain's suicide in April 1994, around which time the first issue of Words I Might Have Ate appeared, and the first Spice Girls single in July 1996, around which time I printed my final issue, was the high tide of a particularly recalcitrant kind of American and quasi-American indie band who, in their relentless thirst for anonymity, made their notoriously fame-shy grunge predecessors look like the cast of a Saturday night ITV talent show. Bum, J Church, Porter Static, and Philistines Jr., for example, are all bands that featured prominently in my third issue. Today, I can't, for the life of me, remember what they sounded like. And it just goes on. It's well worth a read. It's very funny. You know, the point of our endeavours was more like an extension of the band T-shirts we wore, a substitution of musical references for personality. The more enigmatic and pointless, the better. The other thing I want to mention is a shout out to a new writer who's just got on board, Stuart Smith, who writes about jazz, improvisation, underground experimental music, all kinds, and all about Glasgow scenes as well. And he's Dr. Stuart Smith, in fact. I think he teaches at Newcastle University. And he reviewed Val Wilmer's recent photo book, Deep Blues 1960-1988, published by Cafe Royal Books, for The Wire in January of this year. He writes about the cover shot, which is of the pianist Roosevelt Sykes at the Chinese Jazz Club in Brighton in 1961. Wilmer writes of his sophistication and impeccable suits, and that's made abundantly clear in the photo. Debonair in bow tie and tuxedo, Sykes sits at the piano, left eyebrow slightly raised as he sings into an old-fashioned ribbon microphone. The suited British hipsters gathered behind him look like bankers in comparison. I think that's great. And I also wanted to shout out, Cafe Royal Books have just published another small book of Val Wilmer photographs, American Drummers 1959 to 1988, which is a wonderful-looking document. And they're lovely little books, like 36 Beautiful. Pages or so, and they're yes. super objects to have. So go out and pick yourself up a copy of Val Wilmer's American Drummers 59 to 88.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jasper. Brilliant. That brings us to the end of episode 185 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. If you've enjoyed it.
185.
Yeah. If you've enjoyed it, please follow our podcast on whatever platform you use, and do give us a review if you can. Do also visit Rock's Back Pages itself. Check to see if your local library or academic institution subscribes to RBP, and if not, maybe suggest they take a free trial of the world's largest archive of music journalism. And do also buy Andrew's great new book, Devil in the Stack, A Coding Odyssey, or a Code Journey, Coding Odyssey here in the UK, published by Grove Press, and his equally great earlier tomes, Moondust and Totally Wired. We will be back in a fortnight with the great Robert Hilburn to talk about his new biography of one of my absolute favourite artists, Randy Newman. But for now, it's a big thank you from all of us to our guest. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And we will try and go out in perfect harmony together, singing the word goodbye. So all together now.
That concludes episode 185 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Andrew Smith. Devil in the Stack, A Coding Odyssey is published by Grove Press and available now. Visit Andrew's website at andrewsmithauthor.com for more details. The hosts are Barney Hoskins and Mark Pringle, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison-Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.